John here.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm good. Um, just in terms of whether we should adopt a particular license or not, my view is that the more freedom we have with licensing, the
Yeah,
more opportunity there is for different flavors of software, different sorts of solution, different sets of partners who would want to contribute to it to get involved. And I think that, to me, is what we're all about, is trying to make sure that we get the best of the best of all possible worlds, and let the details of the licensing more or less take care of itself, which I know is an incredibly blasé way of putting it, but basically not get in the way of choosing the right products. And so
yeah,
I think it would be a mistake to start off from a premise that says we only want to have a particular sort of license.
yeah. So your view is your objective is to get a contribution back from the community and enable a community to support the software development.
I think it would be my objective is not to put barriers in the way in the first place. You know,
Yeah,
before we embrace, and if somebody comes along and says, here, I've got this great piece of software and it's not quite GPL, it's one of the other ones, I wouldn't like to think that that would mean we'd say, oh, we're ruling that out, because either you've
yeah,
got to be fully commercial or you've got to be GPL.
yeah, yeah, I got you.
Okay.
Actually, this view have been emphasized during many talks. I have talked with NHS ICT manager, the directors, or ICT analysts or suppliers. I think I think this is a very good point. From my understanding, I totally agree with you. I think that firstly, it needs to be benefit both commercial and the public. And the other thing, if we say you must apply the GPL, it will prevent a lot of people or suppliers from contributing to the project. So, any other views? I want to show is a very simple flow chart. So, cause many people ask me to say, I have some very simple, very simple software tools, and I just want to put in open source domain, but they don't know whether they need the license or not, and which one need to choose. So this diagram is basically to provide a very high level guidance for them. So if you have something you want to put into open source domain, I think firstly you need to think about what's your purpose. If it's internal use, I don't think you really need an open source license. But if you want to get the external parties involved, or potentially it will be potentially it will be used by different organizations. I think in this case, an open source license, you need to think about what license is appropriate for you. So from this diagram, we can say, after you identify your purpose, if you think it's not internal use only, you need to consider the conditions of a different open source license. And if you think you want to encourage the contribution, perhaps you need a non-permissive license to engage with the supply participants. But if you want to enforce the other people who use your components to contribute it back, and you perhaps want to choose a non-permissive license. It's really a very simple diagram, and which is put on the ecosystem knowledge center so everyone can access. Because mainly, I think this is from the academics perspective and without any real experience in the reality. And I want to know, if you want to open source something, what would be the checklist you want to go through? What's the key questions you want to ask? I know some of you, like Rob, because your company offers an open source service. So in any circumstances, you need to convince your clients what's the key issues they need to understand before they go down open source routes?
Natalie, I'm just looking at this PDF in more detail. Can you tell me why the output of that you've identified, if I just go along the top line, why do you recommend an output of a closed source code because there is no action required regarding licensing, just because it's internal at the moment? I'm just wondering why that is. Perhaps we should be encouraging all things to be reused and recycled, and in the event that any code has been written to solve a business need, for example, a data extract from a Rio patient administration system and an import into an SQL routine, the only use case for it is internal to the organization that has this need. However, there are hundreds of sites which use Rio, hundreds of information teams, hundreds of people doing this similar work. Is there not an opportunity here to say, could this code be reused by anybody within the NHS? And if so, therefore I will contribute it to an eHealth open source forge. So even in the event that it's only for internal use and maybe even for only for single use, to encourage this method, this mindset of share with your fellow NHS people and put it out as open source. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I think when we develop the diagram, we think from both suppliers, NHS academics perspective. So we consider some of the, for example, from suppliers perspective, they might don't want to put all the components, all the code files under open source license. But I think from NHS perspective, I think this is I think if we can open source not open source, put all the components we develop under open source license, that it will definitely facilitating the reuse, the sharing, etc. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So with the advent of the new Cabinet Office guidance, basically forcing all procurement bodies or suppliers rather, to consider open source alternatives, this flowchart ought to be the other way around. It ought to start off with, so you're content with using open source, that's great. What license are you proposing to use? And then if the answer is no, we're not content with using open source, then we gradually get to a more closed solution. It seems like this flowchart is forcing you to do work to justify openness, whereas it ought to be the other way around, surely.
Yeah, I think part of the reason is this is developed about a year ago. Yeah. So at that moment, it's really about we need to convince people why you should open source as a starting point, then consider what open source license you need to use. But definitely, because the new ICT strategy pushed out end of March, and the new procurement process will hopefully come out soon. So we need to modify the diagram.
Okay, just a quick point.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I really don't want to go too much details about open source license. So I really just to point out license is one thing definitely need to be taken into consideration if you want to go down open source routes. And so I think at this note, Markun, so I just hand over to you to talk more about how to consider the open standard.
Malcolm Newbury, I'm an independent consultant. I've been with Sun previously in PA consulting and worked around the NHS Connecting for Health for about 10 years. Have to be if I'd worked for the NHS and it's all been around integration technology, information governance, and data sharing. So I'm also co-chair of IHE UK, so this presentation is going to be about 15 minutes about the importance of standards and relationship and relevance to open source. First of all, I want to put forward a little advert for the Guardian event coming up on 14th, 15th of June. It's actually 3 events in one: Smart Healthcare, Smart Gov, Public Procurement, but there'll be 2 stands there where you can see open standards in action. More specifically an IHE cross-enterprise document demonstration, document sharing demonstration. That's in the Open Healthcare stand. And the Open Government feature stand will have a whole load of open source demonstrations. So it'll be quite an interesting event. We're also conducting an open source competition, which is open right now. So if you have an idea for the application of a piece of open source software in health and social care, then we want to hear from you, because you can win an iPad and some advice from IHE and eHealthOpenSource community on how best to take that to market in the NHS. And there'll be keynote speeches and in-stand talks as well. Okay, so open standards. Yeah, I suppose everybody's read the Information Revolution paper, and we're all eagerly awaiting the strategy. Open standards are going to play a big role, or standards are certainly. Hopefully they will be open. But basically the question mark is, what standards are we talking about? How do we accredit the vendors which claim compliance? Who bears the cost of conformance? There's lots of questions to be answered. And also, from an IHE perspective, really we think that open standards are completely useless without an accreditation framework. And that's really what it offers. It offers the ability to accredit vendors and vendor products through a well-defined conformance testing process. So, as well as that, what we think IHE offers is it facilitates a kind of corporate social responsibility in healthcare for IT vendors and an associated route to market. So accreditation is absolutely critical. Can we move on, please?